She stood at the edge of the dusty range with her hair tied back, her eyes hidden behind the kind of sunglasses that could make anyone mistake her for just another ordinary woman trying her hand at something new, and the old leather jacket on her shoulders only added to that illusion, worn down and scuffed like it had seen too many years of quiet use. But her hands betrayed her, not in their trembling because they did not tremble, but in their stillness, the kind of stillness that only comes from someone who had long ago learned to control the surge of adrenaline that should have been rushing through her veins at the sight of the targets lined up in the distance, each painted with fresh layers of white so the bullets would leave clear evidence of accuracy. And as she stepped forward, slotting herself into the lane with a composure that drew glances from the men and women already shooting, she seemed to carry an invisible weight, a story written in scars no one could see, a hidden fire she had never let burn in public. But the system, the one that monitored, catalogued, and judged every participant who ever walked into this government-run training ground, had been designed to detect anomalies, and it had already flagged her the moment she swiped her ID at the gate, whispering silently to the watchful eyes in the tower that something in her records did not match the calm surface she presented. Yet no alarm had been raised because the overseers were curious to see what a woman like her would do when handed a weapon and given space to act without disguise. So they let her through, their invisible sensors studying her every heartbeat, every micro-expression, every intake of breath, and as she picked up the matte black rifle provided, running her palm across its body as if she were reacquainting herself with a long-lost friend, the crowd shifted uneasily, because there was something about her movements that felt too natural, too rehearsed, too perfect for someone who had supposedly come here for a casual round. And then the first shot cracked through the air, slicing it like lightning on a clear day, the bullet punching into the exact center of the target with a precision that left even the most experienced shooters pausing mid-breath, their own rifles hanging forgotten for a moment as they glanced down the range to confirm what they thought they had seen. And before the echo of that shot faded, she fired again and again, each pull of the trigger as smooth as a whisper, the rounds punching a single hole through the paper, carving it cleaner and cleaner until it looked less like shooting practice and more like surgical execution. And the murmurs began, low at first but quickly spreading across the range, people asking one another who she was, where she came from, how she could do what she was doing, because they had all seen professionals, veterans, and even ex-special forces operators train here, but none of them had ever moved with the quiet certainty she now displayed. And the system, with its cold intelligence and endless archives of data, was already cross-referencing every file it had on her, pulling fragments of a life she had buried, files classified and hidden away, records scrubbed and rewritten. Yet here, with each flawless shot, the algorithms were beginning to piece together a profile they were never meant to rebuild, flagging her as more than a civilian, more than a woman looking for release or distraction. And in the tower above the range, behind bulletproof glass, a pair of officers leaned forward, staring at the live feed of her performance, their eyes narrowing as the words "unknown asset" began to flash across their screens in pulsing red. And still she shot, calm as a storm held in a jar, her lips pressed in a thin line, her stance unshakable, until at last she lowered the rifle, not because she missed, not because fatigue touched her, but because she had already said everything she needed to say with those bullets. And as the system tracked the subtle flex of her jaw, the tightening of her grip, the slow exhale she released, it triggered a deeper scan, unlocking protocols reserved only for threats, its sensors detecting the presence of something buried not in her hands or her muscles but in her very blood, something enhanced, something dangerous. And while the onlookers whispered in awe, she simply placed the rifle back on the table and began to walk away as though nothing had happened. But deep beneath the surface of the facility, behind doors no civilian ever knew existed, alarms had started to hum in silence, not audible to human ears but transmitted directly to the operative station miles away. And in that moment, without her knowing, the quiet life she had fought so hard to protect, the years spent hiding in plain sight, pretending to be just a simple woman, had been ripped open by the very system she thought had forgotten her, a system that now wanted answers and would stop at nothing to drag back into the light what she had fought to bury in the dark. The corridor lights flickered as the hum of unseen machinery deep within the compound began to rise, a low vibration that seemed to seep through the floor and into the bones of those who walked it. And far below the range where she had fired her shots, a secure chamber filled with monitors lit up as lines of code streamed faster than human eyes could follow, decrypting sealed files that had been locked away for decades, piecing together fragments of a woman who should not have existed in this time or place, a soldier who had once served in wars officially erased from history, conflicts fought in shadows with weapons that had never been acknowledged by any government. And her name appeared across multiple screens at once, a name she no longer used, a name she thought she had burned with the ashes of her past, But the system remembered, the system never forgot, and it began broadcasting alerts across encrypted channels, sending warnings to men and women stationed in black rooms around the country, operatives who had been told to wait for the day when the ghost would reappear. And as those messages spread, her walk away from the range slowed, not because she sensed the flood of data that now hunted her, but because she had noticed the shift in the air, the way the chatter of the crowd had fallen into a hush, the way some of the instructors had stopped pretending to be casual observers and were now following her movements too closely, their stares sharp, their postures rigid. And though she kept her sunglasses on and her expression unreadable, inside she felt the weight of recognition, the prickling instinct that always told her when she had been exposed, and she hated it, hated that after years of silence, years of hiding under an ordinary face, one slip of action had betrayed her. But maybe it wasn't a slip, maybe some part of her had known the moment. She picked up the rifle that the old hunger would wake again, the hunger she had starved and caged, the part of her that once thrived in chaos, and she had thought herself disciplined enough to keep it buried, but she had been wrong, and now it was awake and recognized by the very machine built to suppress people like her. Yet instead of fleeing, instead of panicking, she walked slower, calmer, because running was weakness and she had never been weak. She knew that the eyes on her were not the real threat. The real threat came from the quiet hum of drones that were now stirring in their hidden launch bays, the faint distortion of the air as surveillance beams narrowed in on her from satellites overhead, and though she could not hear them, she felt them, the way an old warrior feels the weather shift before a storm. And when she reached the edge of the range where the desert stretched open and endless, she stopped, her boots pressed against gravel, her fingers curling slightly as if she could already sense the trap forming, and in the tower above, the officers leaned closer to their screens, waiting for her to break character, waiting for her to show even the smallest sign of fear. But none came, only silence, only stillness, and that terrified them more than any weapon in her hands, because silence was the language of predators, and they knew now they were not watching a civilian, they were watching someone built for things their world pretended no longer existed. And so the system escalated, its voice cold and mechanical as it pushed directives through secure lines, designation reactivated, status, priority asset or priority threat, and men in unmarked uniforms began mobilizing from underground bunkers, their vehicles masked by civilian shells, engines roaring to life, each one programmed to converge on her location within minutes. And still she stood there, her back to the range, her face turned toward the horizon as if she had already seen this play before, as if she had known this day would eventually come, and maybe she had, maybe in the quiet hours of her supposed normal life she had dreamed of it, the day when she could no longer pretend, when the ghost would no longer stay buried. And as the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of burning oil from some distant industrial plant, she exhaled, a slow, deliberate release. And then for the first time since she arrived, she allowed herself to smile, a thin, sharp smile that never reached her eyes, because if the system wanted to unleash what she had hidden, then it had better be ready to see all of it, not the fragments, not the shadows, but the full truth of the weapon she was. And in the tower, one of the officers cursed under his breath, realizing too late that they had not cornered her. She had cornered them, because she had known every step of the range, every blind spot in the cameras, every delay in their response times. And while the system believed it had exposed her, the truth was she had allowed herself to be seen, not by accident but by choice. And that choice meant the game had already begun, and she was not just a player in it, she was the storm that would decide how it ended. The desert wind whipped harder now, dust rising in thin spirals as if the earth itself could sense the tension coiling tighter with every second. And she began to walk again, her boots crunching softly against gravel, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, as though she had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to arrive there. But she knew the response units were already closing in, their convoys hidden beneath cloaking signatures that bent light around their frames, their engines whispering at frequencies designed to blend into the hum of the environment. Yet she felt them like static in the back of her mind, the kind of awareness that had been drilled into her years ago when she was still property of a program no one admitted existed. And she knew the numbers, she could practically hear the count in her head. 6 vehicles, 2 drones circling higher than the eye could see, each carrying suppression tech meant to immobilize without killing, because she wasn't marked for elimination, not yet, not until the higher command decided she was beyond retrieval, and that meant she had a small window, a fragile gap of minutes where she could decide the shape of what came next. And instead of running, she veered off the gravel path, stepping into the stretch of broken desert terrain where rocks jutted like jagged teeth from the sand, a landscape that seemed chaotic to outsiders but to her was a battlefield map, each formation a shield, each slope a potential trap. And as she wove into that natural labyrinth, the sensors tracking her struggled, their signals scattering against stone, and in the tower above the range the officers cursed again, shouting into comms as they lost her trace for moments at a time, and the system recalibrated, narrowing satellites to keep pace with her, but every recalibration cost seconds, and seconds were enough for her to plant shadows where they thought light existed, because she knew how to fight the system. She had been trained by the very architects who built it, and while the officers believed they were hunters moving in on prey, they had no idea they were stepping into an arena she had already chosen. And as the first vehicle approached the outskirts of the rock formations, its matte black body humming low, she crouched behind a ridge, pulling nothing from her pockets, using no weapon, simply waiting, and when the vehicle slowed, scanning its mounted drone, lifting slightly to cast beams of ultraviolet light across the terrain, she moved, a blur of motion more instinct than thought, sliding down the slope with the silence of a shadow, and within heartbeats she was beneath the machine, her hands pressing against the warm steel of its undercarriage, fingers finding the seams where armor met engine, and with a twist that no ordinary human could have managed, she ripped a panel free, wires sparking, circuits shrieking in protest, the vehicle stuttering to a halt before its alarms even registered, and by the time the operatives inside scrambled for their weapons she was gone, melted back into the rocks, leaving behind nothing but a dead machine and the panic of men who suddenly realized they were prey, not predators, and from the tower feed, chaos erupted as one red icon blinked out on their tactical display, the system recalculating again, escalating again, its algorithms demanding heavier intervention, authorize lethal force. The message scrawled across encrypted screens, but authorization was slow, chains of command too tangled for the immediacy of what they faced, and in that delay she struck again, a second vehicle lured into a narrow pass where the rocks pressed close, its sensors glitching as their beams bounced off mineral surfaces, and she dropped from above, her body slamming onto its roof with a precision that made the steel groan, her fists punching through glass before the operatives inside could even aim. And the men screamed, weapons yanked from their hands as if a storm had torn them away, their comms filled with static as the vehicle died like the first, another icon vanishing from the board, and in those moments, with each breath, with each strike, she felt it, the surge she had tried so hard to bury, the fire rushing through her blood like a second heartbeat, the part of her she had starved roaring awake, no longer caged, no longer denied, and it terrified her even as it exhilarated because she knew once it was fully unleashed there would be no going back, no return to quiet streets and anonymous days, but she also knew that the choice had already been made, the system had dragged her back into the light and she would not crawl out half-formed, no, she would come back as the weapon she was made to be, and as the last four vehicles adjusted, their formation tightening, the drones descending lower, their wings humming sharp like razors, she stood atop the shattered wreck of the second machine, the desert wind tearing through her jacket, her sunglasses cracked from the impact but still clinging to her face. And she raised her head toward the invisible eyes watching her from the tower and beyond, letting them see not fear, not retreat, but challenge, a silent declaration that if they wanted the ghost, they had found her, and she would show them exactly why they had buried her in the first place. The remaining vehicles fanned out with the precision of soldiers who had drilled this maneuver 100 times in simulation, their engines growling louder now, no longer cloaked but roaring as if to declare their presence, trying to drown out the fear curling in their throats, because already 2 of their units had gone silent, 2 black icons blinked off the map, and that kind of loss in under 5 minutes was something they weren't trained to process. But orders were orders and the system's directives burned red across their dashboards, advance and contain, and so they pushed forward, their weapon systems activating with a cold hum, hatches opening to reveal turrets designed not for civilians but for enhanced targets because they knew now what she was, or at least the system told them what she was, and the system never lied, but even as they rolled into the maze of rocks, shadows twisting against their headlights, she was already moving, not retreating but circling, her senses alive in ways no technology could replicate, her mind running calculations faster than any algorithm, predicting angles, trajectories, the rhythm of machines like she was listening to a song only she could hear, and she felt the desert beneath her like an extension of her own body, the crunch of sand, the vibration of steel tires biting into gravel, every detail feeding her, shaping her next move, and when the drones dipped lower, their thin frames slicing the sky as beams of scanning light cut across stone, she broke into a sprint, her body a blur that no human eye could follow, each stride propelling her like she was weightless, and she leapt, grabbing the edge of a jagged formation, pulling herself upward with explosive power, scaling rock that should have shredded her palms but leaving no blood, no hesitation, and from that high vantage she could see them, 3 vehicles now tightening around the pass, the 4th lingering behind as backup, their turrets whirring, barrels turning, heat signatures glowing red through her fractured lenses, and the drones above weaving back and forth like vultures, their engines shrieking in metallic hunger, and she smiled again, sharper this time because they thought numbers and firepower would be enough, but she knew numbers could not outmaneuver ghosts, and as the nearest vehicle turned its cannon upward, the heat sensors locking onto her silhouette, she dropped, not away but straight down, slamming onto the turret before the gunner could fire, her fists tearing metal like fabric, sparks raining down as circuits died beneath her hands, and she spun, ripping the cannon free, swinging it like a spear into the windshield, the operatives inside screaming as glass shattered and steel crushed, the vehicle collapsing under its own weight, and she rolled off before the explosion, dust and flame tearing skyward, the blast throwing shadows across the rocks, and already the other two machines were moving, tires skidding, turrets swinging, drones swooping lower, beams searching frantically, but she was already gone, sliding through smoke like it was a curtain, her body moving with the rhythm of survival she had once promised. Herself she would never embrace again, and in the tower above, the officers could only watch, their feeds scrambling from interference, icons blinking out one by one, the system screaming errors across their screens, recalibrating faster and faster, trying to outthink her but failing because she was not a program, not predictable, she was chaos wrapped in human skin, and chaos had always been the system's greatest weakness, and as the second of the three vehicles tried to pin her with suppressive fire, its cannons hammering the rocks, sending shards spraying like knives, she slipped beneath its line, rolled across gravel, and rose with her hand pressed to its side, gripping a seam, tearing open a hatch, dragging one of the operatives out screaming before tossing him across the sand with the kind of strength that cracked bone on impact, and the others inside panicked, firing blindly, bullets tearing through their own controls, sparks spitting back in their faces, and she slammed the hatch shut, locking them in their chaos as the machine lurched forward, driverless, ramming into stone and crumpling like paper, another icon vanishing from the board, and the drones above shrieked louder, their wings folding into attack positions, thin barrels extending as energy cores glowed, preparing to unleash beams that could cut through steel like butter, but she looked up at them, unflinching, and when the first beam carved into the rock beside her, melting stone into rivers of glass, she sprinted straight toward the second drone, leaping higher than the operatives in the tower believed possible, her fingers catching its undercarriage, her weight pulling it down in a violent arc, its engines whining, metal screaming, and she twisted, ripping free a piece of its wing and slamming it into its own chassis, sparks and flame devouring it as it spiraled into the sand in a crash that shook the ground, and the last drone faltered, its AI recalculating, struggling between attack and retreat, but she wasn't giving it time. She grabbed the fallen drone's wing, spinning it like a blade, hurling it with perfect accuracy, the jagged steel slamming into the last drone mid-flight, tearing it apart in a burst of fire that lit the desert like false dawn, and in the distance, the last vehicle tried to turn, tried to reverse, but she was already there, moving faster than headlights could follow, and as she slammed onto its roof, the feed in the tower cut to static, the officers staring at dead screens, their mouths dry, because in less than 20 minutes the woman they had thought was a curiosity had annihilated their entire strike team, and the system's red warnings pulsed brighter, demand escalation, code black, authorize full deployment, but somewhere deep in their hearts the officers knew deployment wouldn't matter because they weren't dealing with a target, they were dealing with a force, and no system had ever truly known how to cage a storm. Smoke still hung in the air like a curtain of ghosts, the acrid scent of burning circuits mixing with scorched sand, and she stood in the silence left behind by the wreckage, her chest rising steadily, not from exhaustion but from the rhythm of a body that had just been reminded of what it was built for, and around her the desert stretched vast and endless. But she knew it wasn't empty, she knew silence never lasted in games like this, because for every strike team that fell, another waited in the shadows, hungrier, heavier, less afraid, and she could already feel the tremor of their approach, not in the ground yet, not in the air, but deep in that sixth sense carved into her long before she fled the program, the warning that always came before the next wave, and she tilted her head slightly, listening, like a predator catching the sound of distant prey, and when she heard nothing she smiled again, thin and sharp, because the absence of sound was the loudest confirmation she needed. They weren't just sending men this time, they were sending something worse, and the system itself was preparing to step into the field. Not only as the eye that watched but as the hand that killed, and she turned slowly, scanning the wreckage, searching the twisted steel of the last vehicle until her eyes caught the faint flicker of light among shattered panels, and there it was, a small black cube humming faintly, blinking with the steady pulse of a heartbeat, and she crouched, brushing away debris, her hand hovering over it, because she knew exactly what it was, the relay beacon, the silent witness, the proof of what she had just done, already transmitting data to the satellites above, every detail of her movements, every strike, every moment of unleashed power, and she thought briefly of crushing it beneath her boot, erasing the record, but she didn't because it was too late. The system had already seen, already fed on her every move, and destroying the beacon would only be theater, so instead she picked it up, feeling the vibration in her palm, a steady pulse that seemed to sync with her own heartbeat, and for a moment she let herself feel the strange irony of it, how the thing that exposed her also connected her back to the world she had run from, how even after years of hiding, a single act, a few bullets, had rewritten her life, and now she wasn't running anymore, not from them, not from herself, and she closed her hand tight around the cube until it cracked, sparks spilling across her palm, the hum fading into silence, and as the final flicker of light died, she whispered something so soft it was almost swallowed by the wind, "Come then," and as if the system heard her challenge, the ground began to shake, not subtly, not like the faint tremors of engines, but violently, like the desert itself was waking, and she looked up just as the first shadow fell across the horizon, massive and unnatural, stretching long and wide, and then the machines arrived, not the small vehicles of before but armored giants, six-legged constructs walking like predators made of steel, their bodies bristling with weapons, each step sinking deep into sand as their cannons rotated with a low, hungry hum, and overhead, the sky filled with new shapes, larger drones, heavier, wings glowing with thrusters that burned blue against the dusk. And this was the escalation she had expected, the real teeth of the system, and as she stood between the wrecks of what she had already destroyed, she laughed, not loud, not mad, but low and steady, because they still didn't understand. They thought escalation would bring fear, they thought bigger machines and brighter weapons would be enough to tame what they had unleashed, but fear had died in her long ago, buried with the name they had taken from her, and as the giants closed in, their sensors focusing, their cannons locking, their AI cores buzzing with analysis, she rolled her shoulders once, stretched her hands, and let the fire in her veins rise fully, no longer suppressed, no longer disguised, and for the first time in years she felt the raw force of what they had made her, humming in every nerve, every muscle, and she welcomed it, because the storm they had awakened was not going back to sleep, not tonight, not ever. The steel titans advanced in perfect synchronization, each step shaking the desert floor like a drumbeat of war, their armored frames glinting under the pale light of the moon that had begun to climb the horizon, and from their spines rose turrets the size of small cars, glowing faintly as they charged, their AI-driven optics narrowing in on her position, scanning, calculating, predicting trajectories, yet for all their complexity, for all their billions of lines of code and circuits humming like artificial hearts, they were still machines, predictable, methodical, chained to logic, and she was not. She was chaos wrapped in flesh, unpredictable, adaptive, and as the first Titan lowered its cannons and fired, a beam of searing white heat tearing across the desert and slicing a jagged line through stone where she had stood seconds earlier, she was already moving, sprinting with a speed that blurred her outline into the dust, rolling behind a ridge as the blast exploded in a roar that rattled the rocks, shards raining around her like glass, and she pressed low, feeling the vibration of their steps, the rhythm, the intervals between their attacks, mapping them in her head with the same precision she had once used to orchestrate ambushes in forgotten wars, and she knew she couldn't win by brute force, not against armored giants designed to level cities, but she also knew she didn't need brute force, she just needed cracks, small weaknesses, because every machine no matter how perfect carried flaws, and the system in its arrogance had forgotten that she was the one who had once been trained to find them, to break them, to turn the might of technology into ash with nothing but her body and her will, and as another beam scorched the ridge, she leapt, climbing the shattered stone in bursts of movement faster than any optic could fully track, and when she reached the crest, the second Titan was waiting, its sensors flaring red as it pivoted, massive claws digging into the sand, and it struck with a swipe that could have torn through tanks, but she ducked, rolled forward, felt the wind of steel inches from her spine, and she came up beneath its belly, her hands finding the glowing seam of its undercarriage where heat bled through vents, and she slammed her palms into it, channeling everything she had into the strike, the metal shrieking, cracking, her strength amplified by the fire in her veins until the vent tore open, and a blast of superheated gas erupted outward, burning across its own legs, sending the machine stumbling, its balance faltering as alarms screamed from within its chassis, and she pushed off before it collapsed, sprinting across sand that glowed from residual heat, her jacket smoking at the edges, her skin blistering where the fire had licked her, but she didn't slow, didn't falter, because pain was nothing now, pain was fuel, and the other Titans saw, their cannons swiveling, 3 beams firing at once, crossing into a triangle of destruction meant to vaporize her, but she twisted mid-stride, her body folding into impossible angles, flipping into the air as the blasts collided beneath her, the explosion tearing a crater that lit the desert sky like a second sun, and she landed on the back of the third Titan, claws of steel scraping as it bucked, trying to throw her off, its turrets spinning wildly, but she crawled across its armored hide with the grip of a predator, finding another seam, this one near its head, and she slammed her fists into it again and again until sparks burst out, the optic core flashing wildly, and then with one final blow she drove her arm straight through, ripping free a tangle of wires glowing hot, the machine convulsing beneath her as its cannons fired blindly into the sky, hitting one of the drones. Circling above, shredding it into flame, and she laughed, breathless but alive, the taste of ash and metal sharp on her tongue, because for all their power, for all their mass, these Titans were not gods, they were prey that simply hadn't realized it yet, and as the crippled giant collapsed, its body sinking into the sand like a dying beast, the others hesitated for a fraction of a second, a pause so small no human eye could see it, but she did, she felt it, the moment of doubt in the cold algorithms, the moment where calculation stumbled against chaos, and she knew then she would win, not because she was stronger, not because she was faster, but because she was the one thing the system could never design against. Unpredictable, untamed, alive. The 7th day after the range incident was the one where everything changed, where the system's secret claws showed their truest length and where Margaret, the woman everyone had mistaken for simple, stood face to face with a destiny she had never asked for but could no longer deny. The authorities had transported her under heavy guard to a subterranean facility beneath the capital, a structure carved deep into ancient stone where natural walls met metallic reinforcements, a place where no civilian had ever been allowed to set foot. Shackles of steel that pulsed with blue current bound her wrists, but she did not look afraid. Her eyes carried something different now, something that unsettled every soldier, every technician, every high-ranking commander who dared to meet them. It was as though she had glimpsed beyond the veil, past the rules of their world, and had returned with knowledge that gnawed at the edges of sanity. They escorted her down a corridor of reinforced glass, beyond which scientists watched with sterile anticipation, their tablets alive with readings none dared to voice aloud. The range incident had already leaked into whispers across the capital. A woman who split the ground with her will, who had cracked the system's machines without touching them, who stood unburned in the wake of plasma fire. And yet here she was, silent, her steps measured, her breathing steady, her presence heavier than the soldiers' weapons. She was taken to a circular chamber with a floor etched in concentric rings of metal, pulsing faintly like the heartbeat of something ancient. The commander, a man known only as Gratham, waited there, his armor polished, his voice sharp like broken glass. He told her she was no longer a civilian, no longer simple, no longer anything the system recognized as ordinary. She was property, an asset, a weapon the state would sharpen whether she willed it or not. Margaret did not reply. She only stood in the center of that chamber, her shackles humming, her gaze fixed upon the ceiling where light poured in like a false sky. Then the machines awoke. Rings of light shot upward, encasing her in fields of scanning energy that probed muscle, bone, and spirit alike. The scientists gasped as their instruments failed, screens cracking, sparks flying. The system wanted her secrets, but the system's hunger met something it could not digest. And in that moment, as her knees buckled but her will held fast, Margaret whispered the first word she had spoken since the range, "You think you own me." The phrase hung in the air like a curse, and the lights above shattered into raining glass. Soldiers raised their weapons, alarms screamed, but it was already too late. Something within her had awakened, something buried deep by years of silence, by decades of pretending to be less than what she was. Her pulse matched the rhythm of the chamber floor, her skin flickered with faint threads of gold, and the air became heavy with an electricity no machine could contain. Gratham barked orders, demanding containment, but his voice faltered when Margaret's chains dissolved into dust before his eyes. She stepped forward, unshackled, her bare hands leaving streaks of burning light upon the steel. The soldiers surrounded her, weapons trembling, but none dared to fire. They all felt it, the shift, the raw presence of a force that did not belong to their world of ranks and rules. And Margaret, the woman they had dismissed as simple, spoke again, her voice calm yet echoing with something vast. "You built a system to control power. But power was never yours to begin with." The chamber vibrated, cracks spread across the reinforced floor, and the scientists screamed as their instruments fried. Gratham raised his weapon anyway, a plasma rifle humming with lethal promise, but his finger froze on the trigger. Not because he hesitated, but because something unseen wrapped around his hand and held it still. Margaret had not moved. Her eyes glowed with that golden thread, her hair lifted in the current, and her presence filled every corner of that chamber. For the first time the system understood it had made a mistake. Not in underestimating her, but in trying to claim her. Margaret inhaled slowly as though grounding herself, as though remembering she was flesh and not only force, woman and not only storm. She did not strike them down. She did not run. She only stood there, a still center in a collapsing order, and let the silence deepen until the alarms seemed meaningless. The guards backed away, their discipline fractured by fear, their faith in the system unraveling before their eyes. And Gratham, once proud and unshakable, lowered his weapon with trembling hands. "What are you?" he asked, his voice no longer command but plea. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "What you tried to bury," she answered, and her words carried the weight of centuries. The chamber went dark as the last of the lights died, leaving only her faint golden glow to hold back the blackness. In that moment she was no longer a prisoner. She was no longer their weapon. She was something else entirely, something the world would have to reckon with. Something the system, for all its iron and fire, could not cage. And as the silence deepened, Margaret closed her eyes, not out of weakness, but to steady the storm inside her. Because she knew this was only the beginning, and the world beyond that chamber was not ready for what was coming. El rugido de la multitud resonaba como un trueno contenido dentro del gimnasio convertido en arena improvisada, donde los ojos de todos estaban fijos en ella. Aquella joven que meses atrás había sido objeto de risas, burlas y desprecios, ahora se alzaba con la frente erguida, sosteniendo el rifle con firmeza, el cuerpo marcado por cicatrices recientes, y el corazón latiendo con la certeza de que ese era el momento en que debía demostrar que ya no era la misma. Los reflectores iluminaban cada gota de sudor en su piel, cada herida que no había tenido tiempo de sanar, cada mirada determinada que proyectaba hacia quienes en un inicio habían dudado de ella. Frente a su oponente, un veterano del campo de tiro, la tensión era tan espesa que podía cortarse con un cuchillo. La cuenta regresiva resonó, y el silencio absoluto inundó la arena. No se escuchaba nada más que la respiración pesada de ambos. En cuanto el disparo de inicio estalló, ella se movió con una precisión calculada, como si cada paso hubiera sido enciado miles de veces en su mente, cada acción dictada no por la duda, sino por la determinación que había forjado en carne viva. Cada blanco que caía a su disparo arrancaba un eco ensordecido de la multitud. Cada movimiento suyo era un recordatorio de que la chica burlada, la que había sido subestimada, se había convertido en un fenómeno que ya nadie podía ignorar. La batalla se tornó feroz, con ambos competidores mostrando un dominio absoluto de la disciplina, pero lo que a ella la diferenciaba era esa rabia contenida, esa promesa silenciosa de no volver jamás a inclinar la cabeza. El público comenzó a correr su nombre, un nombre que semanas antes había sido sinónimo de debilidad, ahora era grito de guerra. Sus rivals miraban con asombro, comprendiendo demasiado tarde que las cicatrices que lavaba en el cuerpo no eran marcas de derrota, sino trofeos de batallas que había sobrevivido. En un instante decisivo, cuando el cronómetro se acercaba a su final, ella realizó una maniobra arriesgada, deslizando su cuerpo por el suelo y disparando en ángulo imposible, derribando el último blanco con un estruendo que retumbó en cada rincón del recinto. El silencio fue tan inmediato que parecía que el tiempo se hubiera detenido, hasta que un rugido colectivo estalló, más fuerte que cualquier tormenta, más ensordecido que cualquier disparo. No era solo una victoria, era la consagración de un nuevo mito, el nacimiento de una leyenda. Ella alzó el arma sobre su cabeza, respirando con dificultad, con el corazón en llamas, mientras sus ojos brillaban con la certeza de que lo imposible ya había sido conquistado. Lo que comenzó como una burla se transformó en respeto, lo que era debilidad ahora se había vuelto fuerza. Y mientras los vidrios crecían, mientras las lágrimas corrían por sus mejillas y sus labios temblaban en una sonrisa apenas contenida, sabía que no era el final, sino apenas el comienzo de algo mucho más grande, una historia que seguiría escribiéndose con pólvora, courage y un fuego imposible de apagar. The end.